Start with
Yes.
Shreyas.
Yeah.
So can you please share your presentation?
Sure. Good evening, one and all. I think come to the fag end of the first day. It's been a long day, I guess, for most people here. And once again, thank the entire scientific committee for having me over. So my topic for now is the biostatistics relevant to postgraduates. And this is a presentation which I think I first prepared about 10 years back, and it has helped me ever since whenever I'm writing a paper or even reading a paper. And though 6 minutes is very short to go through biostatistics, I'll try to do my best and try to bring out the salient aspects at least. So couple of slides regarding the methods. So one is first and foremost, when you're starting to perform either a PG thesis or any study, you should have a very well stated hypothesis, which should be specific, precise. You should have a clear endpoint. Your primary and secondary endpoints or primary, secondary measures should be very well defined. The second thing that we must do is to look at the study population. Again, it's extremely important that you clearly demarcate the study population, have well-defined inclusion and exclusion criteria even before you start thinking about conducting the study. The third is sample size and statistical power. I'll try to briefly deal through sample size and statistical power. The reason I'm bringing this point is very often we end up performing a study and then take the results to the statistician and say, please do the statistics for me. It's very important that we involve them right at the inception stage itself, so that, right from the construct of your Excel sheet, your sample size, everything is very well done. And then you conduct the study. This way, your results will not be just a random post hoc analysis, but will actually be concomitant to what you're actually trying to study. So with regards to sample size and sample size calculation, we have two errors which you need to keep in mind. One is the type 1 and type 2 error. And then what is the expected prevalence of disease which you have in your cases and your controlled group? And then if you're having an intervention, what would be the effect of the intervention? What is the likelihood effect of the intervention? This could be based on past studies, or could be based on certain assumptions, or what you feel is a clinically significant difference for us to say that a procedure is different from the other one, whichever one is being studied. So these are the things which you need to provide a statistician before they go ahead. So what are type 1 and type 2 errors? Essentially, type 1 error is where there is a statistically significant difference when actually there is no true difference. So that is what we call a null hypothesis becomes falsely rejected. So usually we set this at 5%. And that is called as alpha error. The other is the type 2 error. This is when you actually fail to demonstrate a statistically significant difference when there is a true difference between the two arms of the study. So this is when the alternate hypothesis is falsely rejected. So the error is usually either 10 or 20%. 90% of a power is an excellent study, but 80% is the minimal acceptable platform. Going on to data and variables itself, we need to understand our data before we look at the different studies. So data could either be continuous data, like you have your age, IOP, corneal thickness, endothelial cell counts. All these are continuous data and could be any number completely. The other is discrete data. So discrete data can either be ordinal, which essentially means different stages. So you have different stages of retinoblastomas, stages of RAPD, stages of glaucoma, or it could be nominal. So ordinal or nominal, nominal, which means a yes or no question, which is essentially whether it is present or absent. The same variable can be depicted in different ways. So let us take age. Now age is, if you just say age, you can't say what type of variable it is. But looking at this data, you know that this is any number and it is a continuous variable. Or it could be grouped into young, middle age and old, which becomes an ordinal variable. Or it becomes young and old, which is essentially a yes or no kind of question, which is a nominal variable. The reason we are looking into all this is because the type of test that we use differs between continuous and discrete variables. The other thing you need to know is whether your data follows a bell curve, which is essentially has a standard normal distribution, which we otherwise call parametric data, or it is a non-normal distribution, which we say a non-parametric data. So essentially, your continuous data itself could either be parametric or could be non-parametric, and then you have discrete data. The reason I say this is now to find out whether your data is parametric or non-parametric, there are certain online platforms where you can just paste your data and it'll tell you. You can have histograms, line diagrams, skew deviations, box plots, or a simple thing. You look at your standard deviation. If it is greater than 1/3 of your mean, that means it is a ideally is likely to be a non-parametric data. You could also use a certain test called Shapiro-Wilk test or Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, which again gives you whether it's parametric or non-parametric. Parametric data, again, like I said, follows normal distribution. They are very sensitive tests. They are more efficient, and they are usually represented by mean and standard deviation. Whereas if you have non-parametric data, which is not normally distributed, which can often be the case when you are doing a study, then you generally depict them as median and interquartile range. So I'll just show you a simple algorithm to answer 5 questions by which you can depict what kind of test is to be used. You're either looking at the aim, which is to either find a difference or a correlation, whether your data is continuous or discrete. Then you see whether your distribution is parametric or non-parametric, whether you have less than 2 groups or more than 2 groups, and finally, whether your outcome is independent, the relationship is independent or paired. I have different examples. If time permits, I will go through them. So essentially, this is how the algorithm works. So based on, if you answer each of these questions, whether you are trying to find the difference or correlation, then you narrow the subset. From that, then next you answer whether the data is continuous. If it is a continuous variable, then you ask whether it's parametric or non-parametric. And if it is parametric, whether you have less than 2 groups or more than 2 groups. So let us look at this with an example. So
sorry
here is a study.
sir, please request you to please submit in next 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay. I'll just run through these, just 2 examples, and I'll stop. So this is an endothelial cell count difference where you're trying to see the difference between big bubble and manual. So here you're trying to locate a difference. The data, obviously, because it's endothelial cell count, it is continuous data. This is parametrically distributed by using the test. And you can also see here that this is the mean, this is the standard deviation, and the standard deviation is well below 1/3 of the mean. It's only 2 groups, and then the relationship is independent of each other. So by using this, we then arrive at the fact that an independent t-test has to be done. I'll just use one more example. So now this is another data where you're trying to see the outcome of acanthamoeba keratitis when it is done by keratoplasty or no keratoplasty. Now here, the median duration before diagnosis is measured in IQR, essentially because it was a non-parametric data. So we are trying to look at a difference. These are continuous data, but they are non-parametric, and it's less than 2 groups. If it is less than 2 groups, we are looking at an independent association. Now, if it becomes paired sample, where you're trying to do the same test on a particular group, then you use a paired t-test. If they are more than 2 groups, we use something called ANOVA, or repeated measures ANOVA if they are paired sample. So I think we've run out of time. I'll stop here, and thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Shreyas. I think you are trying to gather a storm in a teacup. I think
Very much
to do that. I mean, let me ask you 2 things. Number one is for a postgraduate who's trying to get into this field of research, like how do we make these semantics and jargon simple? Which is the resource or resources that he can go to so that he can somebody can simplify or deconstruct the whole this complexity? Any suggestions?
So there are a couple of good books which I read, sir, which help me understand these basic semantics, go through how a study has to be constructed. So one is, of course, there's a book called Studying a Study and Testing a Test. And I think it's a free book available. I think it's an age-old book, and we've all been reading it for a long time. But it gives all the basic things necessary. And frankly, biostatistics has not changed recently or suddenly in the last few years. And the other things which I found useful are just YouTube teaching videos, which are given by a lot of biostatisticians, and even looking at simple things, understanding what type of data, what tests to be used. There are a lot of good YouTube videos which are a great treasure reserve. And I think going through this, it is just the tip of the iceberg, is just to create some interest. But if we actually get into the depth of it, I think each study is going to be a pleasure to read and perform.
One elementary doubt, this is for the sake of postgraduates. Every postgrad invariably completes or concludes his study saying method A was better than method B, but they were not found to be statistically significant. How do you actually, try to talk about it? What do you want to tell about this?
So
How
that
does
is what
it actually what means?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I mean, let me start by saying there is no wrong in saying that there is no statistically significant difference. But before we say there is no statistically significant difference, it's important that we see if the construct of the study is done in the proper manner. There are two reasons why your results may not be statistically significant. One, it may not be statistically significant. Two, your study may not be adequately powered to identify a difference. So your sample size calculation may not be sufficient. Your sample size may not be sufficient. The difference which you're trying to see may not be sufficient. So the adequate power is necessary. The second, if your failure to use the appropriate test for analyzing that data. So if you use a parametric test for non-parametric data or a non-parametric test for parametric data, vice versa for normally or non-normally distributed data, then you could have spurious results. So you could have one which is statistically significant, but not actually there is no difference. Or the reverse could also be true, where you don't find a statistically significant difference because the wrong test was applied to analyze the data.
Yeah, perfect. So thank you so much for being the opener as well. I think our charming lady, Dr. Somshila Murthy, is here. Dr. Somshila, you are ready for your presentation?
Yes, I'm ready. I just had 1 minute of doubt when I saw all those movie posters in Shreyas's talk, whether I'm in the correct session or not. So I asked them all.
It was to scare people out, actually.
Some way to retain PG's interest in biostatistics, madam. Otherwise, they will switch off and go.
That's true. That's true. You should have just put the movie instead,
Dr. Somshila, you can start.
Yes, I just need 1 moment. Can I go in third? I just need to fix one problem with my presentation.
You can invite Dr. Chaitra Jaydev.
Thanks. Sorry.
Chaitra is waiting. Okay, you can. Are you ready, Chaitra?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please.
Good evening, everybody. Pleasure to be part of this session. I'll be talking very briefly on literature search. Like Shreyas mentioned, it's impossible to cover this in 6 minutes, so I've hidden a lot of my slides. I have no financial disclosures, and I thank AIOS for this opportunity and the scientific committee and ARC as well. So even before I begin with literature search, all of us like to see our name on PubMed. Very often we keep going and entering our name there and searching, how many papers am I in, where have I got, mentioned. So PubMed is the place to go most often for literature search. But even before you do that, it can help you in a lot other things. Even before you submit, how does it help is it helps us determine whether the particular article that we are writing or we are going to cite that particular article in is within the scope of that journal. So it makes sense to go through, see the journal specifications, see what are the other things that particular journal is publishing on at that particular time. So then you have a better chance. Now everywhere it's COVID. So, you want to see whether they're also keen to take in COVID papers or they've reached that point where they're not taking any more papers. It therefore helps us also to select the right journal, whether research, clinical, general, specialty, subspecialty, surgical or medical, animal versus, human studies, imaging versus clinical. So these are the different types of manuscripts also that you can choose from. Once you go into literature search, you're also going to get more information about the different other types. We are also fixed on writing an original article or a case report. But if you actually go into submit and you start looking for things, you'll realize there are so many more options. So these are some of the special and some of them are invited only. So we need to be very clear about what we're writing for. So coming to literature search per se, why are we searching for literature? Because we want to know what is already published in the world so that we're not writing on the same thing. This will basically increases our chances of getting accepted. And also we want to know what is the best available evidence in the community. So we want to be able to quote that in our own papers. Again, it improves our chances of getting acceptances. So literature search is basically about finding the right articles, but it's not necessary that they're freely available articles. Most of them think that you're going to PubMed, you're going to be able to get all these full text articles. It's not so. I would also suggest that you personalize your PubMed. Going to the website, of course, there's a new website now. You can click on My NCBI and register for an account. This is really helpful because it helps store your searches. It helps make a bibliography of your own articles so that you don't have to keep searching back. So the minute you have your article coming on PubMed, you can directly send it to your bibliography. It's stored there and you can retrieve it, whether to enter it into your CV or otherwise. You can also create a link of your articles and send it, if you make it public, you can send it to others. So if they want to see what all you've published, it becomes very easy and it's there at one place. What is PubMed? It's an index to thousands of biomedical journals that are published worldwide. It is compiled in the National Library of Medicine in the US. And when you search for PubMed, you get a list of references of what is published in these journals. It's also called as a bibliography. So you can see the authors there. You can see abbreviations of the journal title, very important because you are expected to quote it the same way. You'll see the publication details, when it was published, and you'll also see the article title, most importantly. Now, it is what you need to know is that PubMed does not necessarily provide the full text of the articles. It gives you a link to the reference to the journal website. Okay, if the journal is freely available online, you can take it from there, or you may need to pay for it. So you should never say that you found the article in PubMed, because it's never there in PubMed. You found it through PubMed. So now coming to the Boolean logic, there are a few terms that you need to know: this, or, and. These are important things. So basically, why do you use or why do you use not, and why do you use and? Now, what you need to know is and is the default operator used in PubMed. It is used to retrieve a set of which each citation contains all the search elements. So if you look at salmonella separately or hamburger separately, but if you look at salmonella and hamburger, it gives you 12. So it definitely gives you fewer results. So and contains terms together, which gives us less results, or contains at least one of the terms, which obviously gives us more results, and not contains the first term but not the second one, again less results. So bibliographic record, like I mentioned before, has a title, the author, the journal name, the year, and more. So when you're searching, you can search for a word or phrase just in the title of the article. Here we are searching only for diabetic retinopathy. You can search for something written by the author. Here, if you can see there, it's Wilson author. All those articles have come. You can even shorten it or expand it based on the full name or the first name. You can search for articles in a specific journal. Here, if you put the journal title and give the code, you will get all the articles in that particular journal. So these are some important field searches. So I'm not going to the examples because that will be very long. But these are actually important because it helps us to fine tune your search and make your search more specific for your particular article. I do want to go into this incomplete reference, option, because many of us just have few title words. We may not have everything. So look at the single citation matcher. It's very, very useful, wherein you enter the journal, you enter few details and the title words, and you actually manage to get the entire citation. So this is something that I would urge you all to use, and also how to quote the reference. So full text, these are some of the places where you can get it. Online in libraries, you can get full text journals, you can get some other links where it is available. So this is some of the checklist on how to get your article. Make a single point, build credibility, include reviewers and editors' references. It does help. And what then and what now is an important thing if you can put in your conclusion. And don't put too many references in the intro. Evenly distribute over the PMRC and let the paper flow. Not every piece of research is, goes into being a good paper, and don't cut it too thin as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chetra. That was a wonderful presentation. What is that one message you would like to give to the postgraduates to motivate them for this kind of research?
Yeah, so I think I would say start small, but think big. What happens is we always target big and we fall. So start off with small things. I keep telling them, it could be a case report, it could be a letter to the editor even. Don't aim too high and be disappointed by rejects. When you have these small successes, it definitely gives you a confidence to write probably even a review article in a couple of years.
Dr. Krishna Prasad, you would like to ask something?
I think Chaitra is probably the veteran in this particular topic. I've heard her many times. Every time, she normally stops, encouraging people to do that. I think great job, Chaitra. I think more and more things should come from you so that more PGs can actually, start looking into the existing literature to create something new. Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation all over again.
Thank you.
I think Chaitra was one of the youngest persons to be doing so much for the Indian Journal of Ophthalmology when Dr. Natarajan was taking care of it. She was taking care of everything and doing so much, and I'm sure she learned so much over there also.
Yes,
but thank you so much for your talk. Thank you so much for your talk.
Still a learning process, Satyajit, but thanks for those nice words, and thanks, KP sir. Pleasure to speak on this forum.
Thank you so much. Dr. Somshila, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Can you see my slides? And I guess I'm audible. Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha, Dr. Krishna Prasad, and everybody. I think Chaitra has already keyed the topic in. So I just go in a flow, actually, it's good. So I'm talking about a little bit less about accessing journals, but a little bit more about how you actually do the search, and hope to finish in the next 6 minutes. Very brief presentation, just giving a few pointers of the way that we do things. In addition to what Chaitra said, is that why do we, when I say we, it could mean whoever's writing the report or whoever's looking at journals, why do we access journals at all? So for the postgraduates, it would be usually for the thesis, and also for the trainers, their mentors, also for the thesis, we do access. And as Chaitra said, case reports, one of my colleagues likes to call case reports as snacks. So they're quick publications. So you want to access journals, you're writing case reports in a slightly different way. If it's an original article, and in a review, you need to be more exhaustive. Then you want to prepare for presentations. This is for the students, even for us. When we prepare for presentations, we want to know what is latest. And also, for me, the last part is also very relevant, and especially if you're in tertiary eye care, because you get patients with so many complex diseases. So on the spot, you may not know what's happening, and you want to learn about the patient, learn about the disease. These days, internet is at your fingertip. You can even in real time actually find out what's happening and get back to the patient. So there's a little difference in how you would do the literature search, how you would access journals. So if it's a review, it has to be an exhaustive kind of a search. You want to go into everything about the subject, especially if you're writing a thesis. These days, the trend is to not write an exhaustive review about a topic, but only a part of the topic, because ophthalmology has become so vast. So even when you write a review, it's going to be a sub of that topic. And we might want to write textbooks. So we might want to provide online course material either to our students or somewhere else. And then when you're writing the discussion, as Chaitra said, introduction should have few references, but you're writing the discussion, then you want to have a very thorough and robust comparison with other published studies, whether you're writing a thesis or an original article. So what about the resources? The second part that I was asked, what about the resources? There are many resources that can be shared. So you can have libraries, especially well-stocked libraries, as in not physically well-stocked, but those that have access to various journals. So for that, you can just know the right people. And there's lots and lots of online material that is available. So just have to know what to search. I'm not encouraging shadow websites, but I know that many students do use them, where you can get the full text of articles. And last and very important is, if you just can't get something you want, then just contact your friends and colleagues. These days, we're all on various WhatsApp groups, and you always have somebody who may have a subscription and who will be able to help you out with that particular article. So Chaitra already talked about PubMed. I also feel that it is one of the strongest search engine, and it has just about everything, so comprehensive, and we just cannot survive if you're in this field without being thoroughly familiar with PubMed. And I also like Google Scholar. So this is also my go-to, because unlike PubMed, which is a little bit limited, Google Scholar uses the massive search engine of Google, and it not just scientific literature, but it can give you a lot of other things which may not be peer reviewed. So if you're searching about it just to understand, it's different. But if you're searching about a subject in order to write, then Google Scholar is not the best resource, but it works. So I'm going to take you through a very short video talking about both in real time. So I'm going to take you through two search engines and actually search something very specific. So let's say that today I saw a case in the clinic. This was a case of brittle cornea syndrome, and this is a very rare case. So I thought I should look up more about it, and I typed brittle cornea syndrome. So in Google Scholar, it'll just about list everything. So I actually want something that is more recent. So I go to the filter since 2017, and this is the case that pops up. So I can open up the case, I can take a look at it. Maybe it's something similar to the case I saw. So this is BMC journal, which has free access. So I know that I can see the entire report and maybe get some idea about how to treat my patient. So Google Scholar also has many other things you can do. You can cite this in several ways. So it'll immediately bring out the citation in several formats, which you can either download to any of your reference management softwares, or you can also simply copy paste the same thing and paste it directly onto your Word document, especially if you're writing a case report and you need just about, say, 10 references in there. So you can do that directly as well. The other thing about Google Scholar is that you can also maintain your profile in Google Scholar. So it's pretty accurate. It can list all your articles by year-wise or citation-wise, and it can also tell you what's happened to your latest article and also which year were you doing very well and so on. So a lot of statistics and data for you. You can explore this. Of course, with Google Scholar, you won't have articles which are ahead of print, and you will only have the ones that are clearly published on them. So how does PubMed do in comparison? So let's say, same case, I want to look at brittle cornea syndrome, want to know more about it. So I go to PubMed, and the search engine is so fast that you don't even have to type search, it automatically assumes it. And in fact, it sends you many results. It tells you how many results it has. And then the first one is the same that typed up earlier because it was a free online article. Many of them are free PMC. So PMC is PubMed Central. So many of them will pop up and you can see the free article. So this also tells you that in which year you're likely to have more articles. Here in 2019, there were quite a few. And in addition, it can give you many other things, the abstract, full free text or the full text and so on. So PubMed is again extremely powerful tool. It has just about all the possible medical journals in its database, and it's updated all the time, includes ahead of print article. Google Scholar once again uses the Google engine, search engine, which is a very, very powerful search engine. And the only thing is that it also has a lot of non-peer reviewed stuff going on in it. So both of them are pretty useful. That's it. That's all I had. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Somshila. Dr. Krishna Prasad, you would like to add something?
I think that was a very excellent way of actually really demonstrating how to actually go about it. I think a lot of people do it, but still those finer points of really picking up the right thing. I think somebody who uses it very regularly will be able to do it very optimally. And as you said, both PubMed and Google Scholar is very highly underutilized by most of the postgraduates. They're only very specifically interested in their own thesis or some particular thing. I think it's for anything that they actually go through every day. They can use these two resources which are so abundantly cited with so many articles. I think we have to encourage our postgraduates to use these two. I think your talk will go a long way in doing that. Thank you very much, Dr. Somshila.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Somshila. Now we would like to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Rajesh Sinha, who will be speaking on choosing thesis topic and conducting the study. Dr. Rajesh is a professor of ophthalmology. He's in the cataract and refractive division at RP Center, AIIMS. And Dr. Rajesh Sinha, are you there, sir?
Yeah.
Welcome to this ARC session.
Yeah, thanks a lot, ARC, for giving me the opportunity. And I'll be talking about choosing the thesis topic and conducting the study. This is something which we very often face because we get some new candidates, and then we have to understand as guides, as mentors, we have to understand that we are giving a thesis topic. This is not an ICMR project. This is not a DST project that, there has to be a difference between it. So the feasibility or doability by the resident, by the candidate is very, very important. Because the candidate is for a limited period of time, and then So you cannot have some study which is very long, the follow-up should not be too long, and even per day or per week time consumption in the study should not be too much, because the resident is involved in too many day-to-day patient care activity as well. So that is something which we do have to understand. So the feasibility and doability is an important issue. The sample size should be reasonable. It should not be too much. If you think that a study which requires a very high sample size, then you should not do that study. But of course, it should be an adequate sample size that, you know, the power of the study should be at least more than 80%. Otherwise, it will be of no use at all. Now, one should also understand that the student should be able to access the investigative tools. There, in some scenarios, in some situations, in some places, the students are not allowed to, touch all the investigative tools. So these things have to be understood. The feasibility of data collection is an issue in that, and of course, you should have a proper data analyzer who can help the student to analyze the data. This another point, very important point, is that the resident or the student should have some interest or understanding of the topic that you are giving. And that is why if a resident comes to me for the thesis topic that you are my guide, I have been, allotted, you have to allot me the thesis topic, then I just give him a broad topic that you read this, then come back and then we will discuss. So that creates an interest in the student that, okay, it is something that is I can do it. And the topic should have originality, and that is why it should be publishable. Because if you don't publish the thesis, it is the biggest disappointment for your student, because the student at that stage does not understand. So you have to understand. And if it is not published, every whole life that student is asked that what was your thesis and where has it been published. These things are always asked. So the topic should be an original topic, should be publishable. And if it's a human study, adequate experimental or animal study are available in terms of safety and efficacy. And if you think that there is some doubt about it, any issue in terms of some disorder wherein you have some doubt in having the adequate sample size or things like that, or maybe something absolutely new, then there's no harm in doing a pilot study to get the first experience of that and then go ahead. And ethical issues have to be considered. And the topic is something that, okay, you have to select a broad area, as I said. Topics should be something wherein you are working. If you are the guide, you should have a full understanding of that particular area. So select a broad area, go to your niche area, and then select a topic, do an adequate literature search, and then go through the studies done in the past in your own institution. Then you have to identify how different it is, because this is the first question that is asked, that, okay, there was one study which was done here, how different it is from that. And there's a terminology that is called FRIN, that is further research is needed, whether it's needed or not. And that you can get an idea by going through the limitations of the previous studies. Some previous studies have been done and they say that the limitation, however, we could not do this is the limitation of this study. So that gives you an idea whether you can go ahead or not. And before you plan a study, you prepare a research question. And I'll just and again, as I said, that apart from student, the topic should be within the skill limit of the thesis guide as well, and it should appear interesting to the candidate, and the topic should be relevant to the diseases of the geographic area, because if you don't get adequate cases in that geographic area, then there's no point selecting. As far as conducting the study is concerned, you have to write a protocol properly under these heads, and you have to stick to the protocol. The methodology should be formed in such a way that you should stick to the protocol, and don't create too many aims in a study. You should have a primary aim, should be single, and then you can have secondary objectives so that the student doesn't get confused. And plus your study also doesn't give a confusing outcome. And the inclusion and exclusion criteria should be clear. There's some doubt, like, if somebody gives a thesis on CXL in keratoconus and writes an exclusion criteria that the patient should not have keratoconus. So that is not an exclusion criteria, because you are selecting a cohort of keratoconus and therein you are doing CXL. So the exclusion criteria can be something in keratoconus wherein the patient cannot be included in that study, then there shouldn't be any repetition, and one should identify the statistical test to be applied, and a duty assignment should be proper. Like it is not only for the feasibility of the study, but it is also essential for publication, because many of the journals, they ask what are the duties of each individual, and particularly in a blinded study, it is very, very essential. And of course, the IRB approval, which is called OPRS these days, and RCT registration should be done. And the study should not be initiated before IRB approval and RCT registration. One should stick to the written protocol that you have written, try to minimize bias. There should be proper documentation and data collection. And finally, when you are writing the conclusion, you should write based on your outcome. The final outcome should be actual interpretation of data and not something else. It should not extrapolate too many things like that. So a thesis should be something, I would just like to conclude by saying one sentence, that thesis should be something that helps the student not only to publish it because it is for his life. He knows this thing for his, the whole life he's asked this question, that what was your thesis? And the second thing is that it should be doable. So and feasibility, and of course, something which is publishable. These are the key important things when you are allotting a thesis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh, for that wonderful talk. I would like to ask Dr. Chaitra.
Sorry to interrupt, sir, but we don't have time for Q&A. We have to move on for the next session. I'm really sorry for this.
Okay, no problem. Okay. So can we have one more talk then?
Yes, sir. We have our last speaker.
Okay. Can we invite Dr. M. Vanati, please? How to publish?
Yeah. Thank you,
Professor.
Dr. Sat. Can you hear me?
Welcome.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Satyajit. I'll just sort of quickly, I think, pick it up from where Rajesh has left. And my topic is rather going to be a summarization of all what the earlier speakers have said. So how to publish? Why do you want to publish? Because that's the end point of your research, and you want to extrapolate what you've learned on your research to the general audience or to the public or to your target audience. So that's the importance of publishing. Again, you should know what you're writing for. So largely now, I think since Rajesh has already covered a thesis writing, perhaps what most of us are interested on how to write for a particular journal. So you have to identify what is the type of report you're writing. Is it a case report? Is it a letter to the editor? Is it an original article or the review? The approach varies depending upon what is the type of manuscript you're planning to write. The preliminary work would be to do an extensive research on the existing literature, on existing publications in that particular subject of which you're planning to write. Then look at these three particular steps here. Is your research particularly sort of talking about the existing literature or adding on to what is there in existing literature? Who are the particular audience to whom you want to reach out to? And framing a real good introduction. Introducing the subject in a very apt manner is going to go a long way in striking a good note with the reviewer who's going to be reading your particular manuscript for peer reviewing a particular manuscript. When you're starting, also shortlist what is the particular journal you're interested in writing for, or rather vice versa, what are the journals which are more likely to be publishing the subject which you are writing upon. Read up your literature extensively, and it's a good point to note down the points of each particular paper which is of specific interest or relevance to the topic you're writing upon. It's easy to read them, but also remember to write them down so that you know where you need to look back on your notes and where exactly you need to quote them on in your work. Then look at your work and summarize or pick up the essence of your work, mainly being, is your study justified? Is it adding on? Has it identified the lacunae in existing literature on the particular topic? And are your test results answering your research hypothesis? Are your methodology applied relevant to tackling this particular knowledge or lacunae in knowledge here? And what are the inferences you're drawing from your particular research? So once you have formed in your mind all these senses, then you would frame it into these various subheads of abstracts, introduction, methodology, results, discussion, and conclusion. So this is what is going to be the niche of what you're going to be writing. Due to lack of time, I'm not going to take you into elaborations of all what you need to write. But remember, when you're writing your materials and methods after you've done your introduction, the salient features a material and method should contain, should explain, or should mention your study design, the place where the study was conducted, the study sample which was chosen for the study, the relevant inclusion and exclusion criteria, the methodological tests which were aptly applied to test your research hypothesis. Do not forget to mention your ethics approval and informed consent taken here. And you could also mention the research performers. Always analyze and word out or explain the statistical tests which have been applied to show that they have been aptly selected and are appropriate to your data parameters here. Your results should discuss the results of all the methodological tests which you had elaborated earlier, and your discussion should discuss these results and should draw and conclude what the inferences these results are arriving at based on your research factor. So the conclusion should summarize your results and your discussions. Important not to do in your research is that do not plagiarize, and see that your idea is original, and keep your abstract to your last, because abstract is something which every reviewer is going to be reading first, and a well-written abstract is what is going to catch his interest and help him select your paper either for a rejection, either for a publication, or reject it if he feels it's not enough. Again, use a simple divide and conquer strategy. You do not need to write your entire paper in one go. You can organize your thoughts and write it sequentially. And this helps you to relax and approach your writing material in a more relevant manner here. After you've completed, use the help of your peers to review your paper and pick up faults, and your seniors and the professors or under whom your faculty under whom you're doing research can help you to refine your paper further and pick up the faults. The important do's and don'ts, which I've already stated, needs to be original. Your knowledge needs to be thorough. Your mentor plays a huge role in the way you're going to write and publish your research work. Abstract should be very well written. See that the methodology covers all the points which I had mentioned earlier. Use relevant citations. Your conclusion should be apt to what you had researched and not given loose comments or on aspects which you have not researched upon here. So when you get review comments, please look at them with look at constructive criticism, and that helps you to either revise or further enhance your manuscript for a future journal for submission. So happy writing to you all, and thank you for logging in and staying with us this late in the evening. Thanks again. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you
so much, Vanadi ma'am. I would like to thank all the moderators, the expert panel, and the speakers for this wonderful session.